It was January 1944. In the heart of London, in a nondescript building hidden from public view, a secret war was about to begin, not with weapons, but with lies. General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat at his desk, studying maps of the French coast. The invasion of Normandy was coming. Everyone knew it. The Germans knew it. The Russians knew it. But there was one crucial problem that kept Eisenhower awake at night. Hitler believed the invasion would happen somewhere else. This wasn't luck. This wasn't accident. This was the result of the most audacious military deception ever conceived. Operation Fortitude, across the English Channel, in his East Prussian headquarters called the Wolf's Lair. Adolf Hitler studied the same maps with a completely different interpretation. His intelligence officers, had reported that the main Allied invasion force the largest army ever assembled would land, not in Normandy, but near Pas-de-Calais, hundreds of miles to the northeast. A devastating invasion force, they said, led by General George Patton himself. But Patton wasn't leading an army to Pas-de-Calais. In fact, there was no army there at all. What Hitler's intelligence officers were seeing was theater, a masterpiece of deception, so complete, so detailed, and so psychologically perfect that even today, military strategists study it as one of the greatest intelligence victories in warfare. The genius behind this operation was born from a simple truth that military commanders rarely understand. Soldiers believe what they want to believe. Hitler wanted to believe that the Allies would attack where it made the most strategic sense, the shortest distance across the Channel, the most fortified position. His pride, his military intuition, his entire understanding of warfare told him this was where the real invasion would come. Operation Fortitude exploited this weakness perfectly. Every false report, every piece of planted evidence, every carefully orchestrated leak of misinformation was designed to reinforce what Hitler already believed. In London, a team of British military strategists, intelligence officers, and psychologists had calculated exactly how to manipulate German perception. They created an entire phantom army. They leaked false invasion plans. They turned German spies into double agents who fed Hitler exactly what he wanted to hear. They used radio broadcasts, false communications, even inflatable tanks and fake military encampments visible to German reconnaissance aircraft. But here's what made Operation Fortitude truly remarkable. It wasn't just deception for deception's sake. Every lie had a purpose. Every misdirection had a calculation. Churchill and Eisenhower understood that if they could convince Hitler to keep his reserves away from Normandy even for just a few critical days after the invasion, they could secure the beachhead and save thousands of lives. The stakes were incomprehensible. D-Day would be the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, countless lives hanging in the balance, and it all depended on one question. Could a group of British intelligence officers convince the most powerful military dictator in the world to believe an elaborate lie? On the coast of Normandy, the cliffs waited. The tide would turn, and soon the deception would face its ultimate test. In a secure room deep beneath London, surrounded by walls that had never heard a whisper escape, General Bernard Montgomery stood before a map that would change the course of human history. It was February 1944. D-Day was still 4 months away, but the clock was already ticking. Montgomery's face was etched with the weight of impossible responsibility. He knew what others were only beginning to understand. The invasion of Normandy would succeed or fail not on the beaches, but in the minds of German commanders. Every soldier on those landing craft, every tank rolling off the transport ships, every life that would be lost or saved depended on one man believing a lie. That man was Adolf Hitler. General Frederick Morgan, the chief strategist behind Operation Fortitude, had spent months studying German psychology. He understood that Hitler wasn't just a military dictator. He was a gambler, a man who believed in his own genius, a man whose pride could be weaponized. Morgan and his team had developed a strategy so intricate, so psychologically precise, that it bordered on the theatrical. They would create a phantom army led by General George Patton. They would spread false intelligence about massive troop concentrations in southeast England. They would leak information suggesting that Normandy was merely a diversion, a feint to draw German forces away from the real invasion point at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler's own military instincts, his understanding of warfare, His conviction that the Allies would follow the most logical course all of this would become a weapon against him. What made this plan revolutionary was its sophistication. It wasn't enough to simply spread rumors. Every piece of misinformation had to be corroborated by multiple sources. They needed German spies to confirm the false intelligence. They needed radio intercepts that would seem to reveal genuine military communications. They needed physical evidence, fake military camps, inflatable tanks, carefully staged troop movements that German reconnaissance aircraft would photograph and report back to Berlin. They needed everything to feel real, because German intelligence officers were trained professionals, and they would recognize crude deception immediately. Churchill himself understood the magnitude of what they were attempting. He sat in his war room, smoking his cigar, studying the strategic maps with cold precision. The Prime Minister knew that conventional military strategy alone would not guarantee victory on D. The beaches of Normandy were fortified with concrete bunkers, barbed wire, machine gun emplacements, and thousands of German soldiers waiting behind defensive lines. The casualty projections were staggering. But if Operation Fortitude succeeded, if Hitler could be made to believe that the main invasion would strike elsewhere, then German reserves could be held back from Normandy. Those critical first days, those precious hours when the beachhead was most vulnerable, would be protected by nothing more than deception and psychological manipulation. The team assembled to execute this plan included some of the finest military minds in Britain. There were cryptographers from Bletchley Park who could intercept and analyze German communications. There were intelligence officers who had turned German spies into double agents. There were military planners who understood how to stage elaborate false military operations. Each component had to work in perfect synchronization. One mistake, one piece of misinformation that didn't align with the larger narrative, and the entire plan could unravel. Hitler would see through it. German commanders would reinforce Normandy. The invasion would become a bloodbath. As Montgomery left the secure room that evening in February 1944, he carried with him the enormous burden of knowledge. He knew the plan. He knew the stakes. He knew that the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers rested on the assumption that they could successfully deceive one of the world's most dangerous military minds. The question that haunted him was terrifyingly simple. What if they were wrong? In the flatlands of southeast England, a ghost army was being born. Colonel David Strangeways, commander of D Division, stood in a muddy field near Dover and watched as soldiers inflated massive rubber tanks. These weren't real tanks. They were elaborate fakes, masterpieces of deception designed to fool German reconnaissance aircraft. As the rubber structures took shape, Strangeways felt a peculiar mixture of pride and absurdity. Here he was, a trained military officer, supervising the creation of an army that didn't exist. But this phantom force was as crucial to victory as any real regiment. The logistics of Operation Fortitude were staggering in their complexity. Radio operators stationed throughout southeast England broadcast false military communications messages about troop movements, supply shortages, unit assignments. Every transmission was carefully crafted to paint a picture of an enormous invasion force gathering for an assault on Pas-de-Calais. German radio operators, listening carefully from across the channel, intercepted these messages and reported them back to Berlin. The communications seemed authentic. The military terminology was correct. The operational details were plausible. What the Germans did know was that most of these transmissions came from a handful of radio operators, creating the illusion of thousands of soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Roger Hesketh, the mastermind behind much of the deception operation, moved methodically through his checklist. Fake military camps had to be visible from the air, but positioned exactly where German reconnaissance pilots would expect to find them. Supply depots had to be constructed with enough detail to appear genuine in photographs. Dummy airfields, complete with plywood aircraft, had to be erected. Every element served a psychological purpose to confirm what German intelligence officers already believed. The reinforcement of existing beliefs, Hesketh understood, was far more effective than introducing entirely new ideas. General George Patton, the fiery American commander, was given a role that deeply troubled him. He was to command the Phantom 1st United States Army group of force that existed only on paper and in radio broadcasts. Patton hated the deception. He wanted to fight. He wanted to lead real soldiers into real battle. But he understood the stakes. He was told that his visible presence, his well-known aggressive tactics, his reputation as an unstoppable military commander, made him the perfect figurehead for this false army. German intelligence officers knew Patton's reputation. If they believed Patton was leading an invasion force, they would believe the invasion was coming with devastating force. Patton accepted the assignment with the discipline of a true soldier. The double agents played their crucial role in this intricate web of deception. These were German spies who had been turned by British intelligence men who had chosen to betray their homeland or had been forced into cooperation. They passed false information through German channels, feeding Berlin exactly what the Operation Fortitude planners wanted Hitler to hear. Each piece of information had to be just credible enough to be believed, just specific enough to seem genuine, just consistent with the larger narrative being constructed. By April 1944, as spring settled over the English countryside, the Phantom Army was fully developed. Thousands of soldiers participated in fake maneuvers. Hundreds of vehicles moved along carefully planned routes where German spies could observe them. Radio traffic painted pictures of massive preparations. The entire deception had become a living organism, a coordinated assault on the German perception of reality, and Hitler, in his fortress headquarters, believed every word of it. The stage was set. The greatest military bluff in history was about to face its ultimate test. 60 miles north of London, in a Victorian mansion surrounded by sweeping gardens and tall trees, the most important secret of the entire war was being kept. Bletchley Park was a fortress of intellectual brilliance where over 10,000 codebreakers, mathematicians, and linguists worked in absolute secrecy to intercept and decrypt German military communications. For Operation Fortitude to succeed, the planners needed to know exactly what the Germans believed, and Bletchley Park was their window into the German mind. Alan Turing, the brilliant mathematician whose insights had cracked the Enigma machine, understood the psychological importance of what they were doing. Every encrypted message they decrypted, every German communication they intercepted, told them whether their deception was working. Commander Alistair Denniston paced through the corridors of Bletchley Park, studying intercept reports with intense focus. The Germans were taking the bait. Messages from German Army Group B, stationed in France, were reporting exactly what Operation Fortitude wanted them to believe. German intelligence officers were convinced that the main invasion would come at The false information planted by double agents was being corroborated by German spy networks, creating a dangerous feedback loop of confirmation. Denniston felt a surge of cautious optimism, but he also understood the fragility of deception. One intercepted communication that revealed the truth. One German spy who saw through the lie. One lucky German reconnaissance flight that discovered the Phantom Army was for any of these could unravel everything. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park had intercepted communications from the German military intelligence, confirming that Operation Fortitude was achieving its goal. Reports were flowing into Berlin describing massive American and British troop concentrations in southeast England. German officers were reporting the location of fake military camps. The radio intercepts they had captured seemed to confirm extensive preparation for an invasion at German military commanders were recommending that Hitler maintain strong reserves in that sector to counter what they believed was the primary invasion threat. The deception was working with terrifying precision, but there was a deeper psychological dimension that the Bletchley Park analysts understood. They could see, through intercepted German communications, that Hitler himself was becoming emotionally invested in his belief that the invasion would come at Potok. The German leader had repeatedly declared to his generals that this was where the Allies would strike. He had based his entire defensive strategy on this conviction. To change his mind now would require not just new intelligence, but an admission that his military judgment had been wrong. And Hitler was not a man who admitted errors. Major General Sir Kenneth Strong, Chief of Intelligence for Supreme Allied Command, reviewed the Bletchley Park reports with growing confidence. The intercepted German communications revealed that Operation Fortitude had achieved psychological penetration of the German High Command. German generals were arguing about reserve deployments, but their debates all started from the same false assumption that Pas-de-Calais was the invasion target. The deception had created a false reality so complete that German military planning was now locked into defending the wrong coastline. As May 1944 arrived, just weeks before D-Day, The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. Bletchley Park's intercepts confirmed that German reserves were being held back from Normandy. Hitler remained convinced that the real invasion was still coming at the Phantom Army. The false radio broadcasts, the turned double agency had all combined to create an alternate reality in the minds of German military commanders. Operation Fortitude had succeeded beyond even the most optimistic projections. Now came the moment that would determine if this deception could survive the test of actual invasion. Prime Minister Winston Churchill sat alone in his private study, the weight of impossible decisions pressing down upon him like a physical force. It was late May 1944, just days before D-Day, and Churchill faced a moral crisis that few leaders would ever have to confront. On his desk lay intercepted German communications revealing that Hitler still believed the invasion would come at Operation Fortitude had succeeded beyond imagination. But Churchill now faced a terrible knowledge. He knew something that could save thousands of lives, and he had to choose whether to reveal it or keep it secret. The Prime Minister understood that war was a game of deception. But this particular deception had developed moral dimensions that haunted him. Churchill's inner circle had presented him with a strategic paradox. There was evidence suggesting that if they informed the French government about the true invasion point at Normandy, the French resistance could prepare the region for liberation. They could stage uprisings, sabotage German supply lines, create internal chaos that would assist the invasion forces. This knowledge could save countless Allied lives on the beaches. But revealing the invasion point to the French meant risking the entire Operation Fortitude deception. French security was uncertain. German spies operated within French circles. One leak, one careless conversation, and Hitler would learn the truth. German reserves would flood into Normandy. The beaches would become a slaughterhouse. Churchill had to choose between helping the French and protecting the deception that would save far more lives. The psychological burden on Churchill was crushing. He smote his cigars in the darkness of his study, wrestling with questions that no democratic leader should have to answer alone. How many lives was a deception worth? How many French civilians should be kept ignorant of their own liberation to preserve military secrecy? Was it morally justifiable to deceive allies for strategic advantage? Churchill had spent his entire political career defending democratic principles and transparency. Now he was being asked to embrace calculated deception on a scale that violated everything he theoretically believed in. The irony was not lost on him. General Eisenhower had approached Churchill with the same concerns. Eisenhower understood that French resistance fighters were preparing uprisings based on rumors and hope, not solid intelligence. Some resistance cells believed the invasion was coming at Pas-de-Calais, exactly where the Germans expected it. These French fighters might stage their uprisings in the wrong places, at the wrong times, completely disconnected from the actual invasion. They might sacrifice themselves for strategic positions that were irrelevant to the real D-Day plan. Eisenhower asked Churchill for permission to brief selected French leaders. Churchill had refused. The risk to Operation Fortitude was too great. Churchill poured himself a glass of brandy and stared out into the London night. He knew that his decision would mean that some French resistance fighters would die in misguided uprisings. Some French civilians would be killed in fighting that might have been avoided with proper intelligence. French towns might suffer destruction that could have been prevented. But Churchill also knew that if Operation Fortitude failed, if the deception was compromised, tens of thousands of Allied soldiers would die on the beaches of Normandy. British soldiers, American soldiers, Canadian soldiers, young men who were counting on their leaders to make the right strategic decisions. The Prime Minister set down his brandy glass and made his decision. Operation Fortitude would be protected. The French would not be told. The deception would be maintained at all costs. Churchill understood that history might judge him harshly for this choice. Democratic leaders were not supposed to deceive their allies. But sometimes, he reasoned, winning a war required making decisions that violated moral principles to serve a greater strategic good. As dawn broke over London, Churchill carried the weight of this terrible knowledge into the final days before D. In a secure apartment in London's Kensington district, Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Agent Garbo by British intelligence, sat at a typewriter composing one of the most consequential lies of the entire Second World War. Pujol was a Spanish businessman who had been turned into a double agent, technically working for German military intelligence while secretly serving British intelligence. His mission was elegantly simple but psychologically complex. He had to convince the Germans that he was a loyal spy, providing genuine intelligence from inside Britain. Every report he filed, every piece of information he transmitted back to Berlin had to feel authentic while actually serving Operation Fortitude's deception goals. Pujol understood the weight of his role. The information he was sending to Berlin would influence Hitler's military decisions. Thousands of lives depended on his ability to lie convincingly. Pujol's genius lay in his understanding of human psychology. He knew that German handlers didn't want spectacular revelations. They wanted the mundane details of military life supply shortages, troop movements, unit locations, training exercises. He provided exactly what they wanted, carefully woven into a narrative that painted a picture of massive invasion preparations at Pas-de-Calais. But Pujol added touches of authenticity that made his reports irresistible. He sometimes reported information that was slightly inaccurate, as if his sources were occasionally unreliable. He occasionally expressed doubt about certain intelligence, as if wrestling with conflicting reports. These humanizing touches made his information feel credible because it acknowledged the messy reality of intelligence work. The German High Command came to trust Pujol completely. His reports were filed in German military archives, marked as the highest priority intelligence. When German commanders debated reserve deployments, they cited Pujol's reports as justification for keeping forces at Pas-de-Calais. Pujol's fabricated intelligence about the Phantom 1st United States Army Group was treated as confirmed fact by German military planners. He had become so trusted that German intelligence began asking him for specific information. Working with his British handlers, would fabricate answers that perfectly aligned with Operation Fortitude's goals. The deception had become self-reinforcing. The Germans asked for information that confirmed their existing beliefs, and Pujol provided exactly that. But Pujol was not alone. There were other double agents, a carefully coordinated network of turned spies working to feed Hitler exactly what Operation Fortitude wanted him to believe. Agent Tricycle, a Serbian businessman, provided corroborating intelligence. Agent Brutus, a Polish officer, offered military perspective that reinforced the false narrative. Each agent operated independently, unaware of the other's activities, yet all were being orchestrated by British intelligence to create an interlocking web of false testimony. When German intelligence received reports from multiple sources, all pointing to Pas-de-Calais as the invasion target, the confirmation seemed overwhelming. Pujol understood the moral complexity of his position. He was a Spanish national, not bound by British allegiance, but he had chosen to work against Nazi Germany because he believed the regime represented pure evil. Yet to serve that cause, he had to become a master deceiver, a man who specialized in betrayal and lies. His psychological burden was immense. He had to inhabit the mind of a German spy, to think like a man serving the Third Reich, to genuinely understand German military psychology well enough to manipulate it. This required more than technical espionage, it required complete psychological transformation. As May 1944 arrived, the network of double agents had saturated German intelligence with a unified deception. Every German spy in Britain, every agent filing reports back to Berlin, every piece of corroborating intelligence pointed to the same false conclusion. The invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler believed it, his generals believed it. German military resources were committed to defending the wrong coastline. The double agents had accomplished what conventional military force could never achieve. They had German strategic reality, and on the beaches of Normandy, thousands of young soldiers would soon discover that this lie had saved their lives. June 1st, 1944. The English coast was transformed into a vast military staging ground that seemed to strain against the weight of impending violence. General Eisenhower traveled between camps of British, Canadian young men who had no idea that their survival depended on a deception that was still unfolding in the minds of German commanders. Eisenhower's face was carved with the exhaustion of a man bearing impossible responsibility. He had made the final decision to launch D-Day on June 6th. In 5 days, the largest amphibious invasion in human history would begin. and absolutely everything depended on Operation Fortitude maintaining its psychological grip on Hitler's perception of reality. In the War Office in London, General Montgomery reviewed the latest intelligence reports from Bletchley Park. The intercepted German communications confirmed that the deception was still holding. German Army Group B continued to report that the main invasion threat remained at German commanders were arguing about reserve deployments, but their arguments were all premised on the false assumption that Normandy was merely a secondary landing. German panzer reserves remained positioned hundreds of miles away from where they would actually be needed. Montgomery felt a surge of cautious optimism mixed with terrifying uncertainty. The deception had worked brilliantly up until this moment, but nothing was certain. One intercepted radio transmission revealing the truth. One German reconnaissance flight that discovered the Phantom Army was fake. One strategic failure in the carefully constructed narrative, any of these, could still unravel everything. Eisenhower held a final briefing with his senior commanders on June 5th. He stood before the assembled generals and outlined the invasion plan with the precision of a man who had rehearsed these words countless times in his mind. But beneath his composed exterior, Eisenhower carried a terrible knowledge. He alone understood the full scope of Operation Fortitude. He alone comprehended that the invasion's success was not guaranteed by superior numbers or better weapons, but by the ability of a handful of intelligence officers to maintain a psychological deception against one of the most dangerous military minds in history. If the deception failed, if Hitler somehow learned the truth and moved his reserves to Normandy, the invasion would become a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The night of June 5th was filled with a strange silence across the English coast. Thousands of soldiers sat in transports or waited in camps, unable to sleep, wrestling with their own mortality. Some wrote letters home. Some prayed. Some simply stared into the darkness, contemplating the unknown horror that awaited them on the beaches. None of them knew that their commanders had waged an invisible war against German perception for months. None of them understood that the success of their mission there, very survival depended on whether Hitler believed a lie. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler slept peacefully, convinced that the invasion he expected would come at far from where the actual invasion was about to begin. His military advisors remained locked into defensive positions based on false intelligence. German reserves stayed in place, hundreds of miles from where they would be desperately needed in just a few hours. Operation Fortitude had achieved its ultimate objective. The deception was complete. The German military command structure had been successfully manipulated into defending the wrong coastline. But as dawn approached on June 6, 1944, Eisenhower understood that Operation Fortitude's greatest test was about to begin. The invasion was about to launch. Within hours, German commanders would learn the truth. They would realize that the main invasion was coming at Normandy, not Pas-de-Calais. The question that haunted Eisenhower was whether the deception had created enough psychological momentum to keep German reserves committed to the wrong position even after the truth was revealed. Could a liar, once believed deeply enough, remain powerful enough to influence decisions even after it was exposed? The answer to that question would determine whether thousands of soldiers lived or died on the beaches of Normandy. June 6, 1944. At 6:30 a.m., the first Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of Normandy. The invasion had begun. Within hours, German commanders received urgent reports that the main invasion was indeed happening in Normandy, not at Pas. Hitler's military advisors realized they had been deceived. But here is where Operation Fortitude achieved something truly extraordinary even after the Germans discovered the truth. They remained psychologically paralyzed by the deception that had been carefully constructed in their minds. German generals argued that Normandy might still be a feint, a diversionary attack meant to draw reserves away from Pas-de-Calais, where they still believed the real invasion would come. The lie had become so deeply embedded in German military psychology that even reality itself could not dislodge it. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, desperately urged Hitler to commit the panzer reserves to Normandy immediately. Every hour that passed meant more Allied soldiers landing on the beaches, more equipment being offloaded, more artillery being positioned. The military situation was becoming desperate. But Hitler, influenced by the months of Operation Fortitude deception, remained convinced that the main invasion was still coming at Pas-de-Calais. He refused to move his reserves. Rommel understood that this refusal was a catastrophic strategic error, but he was powerless to change the Führer's mind. The deception had achieved psychological penetration so deep that it was now controlling Hitler's military decisions even in the face of contradictory reality. In Berlin, German intelligence officers struggled to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed. Their spy networks, their intercepted communications, their entire intelligence apparatus had convinced them that Pas-de-Calais was the primary invasion target. Now soldiers were being killed in Normandy, but German strategic calculations remained locked into a defensive posture based on false intelligence. The human mind, Operation Fortitude's architects had correctly understood, has enormous psychological resistance to changing deeply held beliefs. Even when presented with evidence contradicting those beliefs, people will often rationalize the evidence, rather than abandon the belief system that had previously made sense of the world. Hitler held a war conference on June 6, where he famously declared that he knew the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais and that Normandy was a deception by the Allies. This was the moment of Operation Fortitude's ultimate triumph. Hitler had received reports of a massive invasion on the Normandy coast. Yet he continued to believe that this was not the real invasion. The phantom 1st United States Army Group, the false communications, the double agent reports, all of this had created such a powerful false reality in Hitler's mind that he was now rejecting actual reality in favor of maintaining consistency with his false beliefs. General Omar Bradley, commanding American forces on Omaha Beach, had no idea of the psychological drama unfolding in Hitler's headquarters. He was focused on the horrifying casualties occurring on the beaches, the soldiers being cut down by machine gun fire, the desperate need for more artillery support. But Bradley benefited directly from Operation Fortitude's success. The German reserves that could have transformed Normandy into a slaughterhouse remained positioned hundreds of miles away, held in place by beliefs that had been carefully planted in German minds by British intelligence officers and double agents. By the end of June 6, 1944, Operation Fortitude had achieved its ultimate objective. The invasion was succeeding not because of superior military force or tactical brilliance, but because German commanders were defending the wrong coastline based on a deception that was so psychologically powerful that it persisted even after being contradicted by reality itself. Hitler's refusal to move reserves from Pas-de-Calais during the critical days of the invasion proved decisive. The beachhead at Normandy held thousands of lives were saved not by weapons or strategy, but by the power of a carefully constructed lie that had become more real to German commanders than truth itself. June 15, 1944. 9 days after the invasion began, Eisenhower stood on the cliffs overlooking Omaha Beach and surveyed the organized chaos of the invasion that was succeeding beyond his most optimistic projections. Over 300,000 Allied soldiers had landed in Normandy. Equipment was being unloaded continuously. Supply lines were being established. The beachhead, which military planners had feared might be pushed back into the sea, was consolidating into a stable foothold. Eisenhower understood that Operation Fortitude had saved the invasion. The German reserves that could have destroyed the beachhead during those critical first days were still positioned at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Hitler still believed that Normandy was a secondary operation, that the main invasion was still coming at Pas-de-Calais. The deception had held long enough to give the Allies the strategic advantage they desperately needed. But the human cost of this strategic victory was becoming apparent in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. Estimates suggested that Operation Overlord would cost between 400,000 and 1 million Allied casualties. The beaches of Normandy had become graveyards where young soldiers were being buried in mass graves. Officers walked among the dead with faces carved from stone, processing the magnitude of sacrifice required to gain a foothold in occupied Europe. Many of these soldiers would not have died if Operation Fortitude had failed, not because the invasion would have succeeded, but because it would have been so catastrophic that it would have been called off. But Operation Fortitude had succeeded so completely that the invasion proceeded, and thousands of young men paid with their lives for the psychological victory that had been won in German minds. General Montgomery reflected on the nature of modern warfare as he reviewed casualty reports from the advancing British forces. Strategic deception had become as important as tactical brilliance and brute military force. The Second World War had revealed that battles were won not just with guns and tanks and artillery, but with carefully constructed lies that manipulated enemy perception. Montgomery understood that Operation Fortitude would become a textbook case in military strategy, studied by officers for generations to come. But he also understood that this victory had been purchased with the blood of thousands of soldiers whose names would never be known, whose sacrifices would be forgotten by history. In London, the leadership of Operation Fortitude began to understand the full scope of what they had accomplished. They had not just deceived Hitler about the invasion point, they had fundamentally altered the course of the war. By manipulating German perception and convincing Hitler to hold reserves they had accelerated the Allied liberation of Europe by weeks or possibly months. They had shortened the war. And yet, some of the architects of Operation Fortitude felt a strange emptiness in their victory. They had won a stunning psychological victory through deception, through the deliberate manipulation of human perception, through lies told so convincingly that they reshaped reality itself. But victory achieved through such means carried a moral weight that was difficult to articulate. Churchill reflected on Operation Fortitude's success during a late-night meeting with his war cabinet. The Prime Minister had chosen to keep the French ignorant of the invasion point to preserve the deception. French resistance fighters had died in uprisings that had nothing to do with the actual invasion. French civilians had suffered in operations planned for the wrong locations, but Operation Fortitude had succeeded and Normandy had held. Churchill understood that war required moral compromises. Leaders had to make decisions that violated ethical principles to serve strategic objectives. The question that haunted Churchill was whether history would vindicate these choices or condemn them. By late June 1944, Operation Fortitude had transitioned from an active deception into historical success. The German reserves remained at Pas-de-Calais 4 weeks after D-Day, still convinced that a major invasion was coming there. Hitler's psychological investment in this false belief was so complete that even as military reality deteriorated around him, he maintained his conviction in the deception that had been planted in his mind. Operation Fortitude had achieved something unprecedented in military history, a strategic victory so complete that it had reshaped the outcome of an entire war through nothing more than carefully constructed lies. August 1944, Paris was liberated. The German forces in France were in disarray. The beachhead that military planners had feared would be destroyed had instead become the launching point for the liberation of Western Europe. Operation Fortitude had succeeded beyond even the most optimistic projections. But as the dust of battle began to settle, the architects of the deception began to understand the full magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had fundamentally changed the course of human history through nothing more than psychological manipulation and carefully constructed lies. General Eisenhower sat in his headquarters in France and reflected on the operation that had made the invasion possible. He understood that Operation Fortitude would be remembered as one of the greatest strategic victories of the war, not because it had been won with weapons or military tactics, but because it had been won inside the minds of German commanders through the power of deception. Juan Pugel Garcia, Agent Garbeau, was awarded both British and German military honors for his espionage work. The Germans never discovered that he had been working for British intelligence the entire time. Pugel had successfully deceived one of the most sophisticated intelligence services in the world. He had sent false reports that shaped Hitler's military decisions. He had played a crucial role in Operation Fortitude's success. Yet Pugel carried the psychological weight of his deception for the rest of his life. He had become a master of lies, a man who had manipulated the perceptions of an entire nation's military command. Years later, Pugel would reflect on his role in the war with a mixture of pride and profound moral ambiguity. He had served a noble cause, Nazi Germany bouté. He had done so through methods that violated every principle of honesty and transparency. General Bernard Montgomery returned to Britain as a hero. Military academies began studying Operation Fortitude as a case study in strategic deception. Montgomery understood that modern warfare would never be the same. Intelligence, psychological manipulation, and the ability to control enemy perception had proven to be as important as firepower and maneuver. The Second World War had revealed a fundamental truth about human nature that would shape military strategy for generations to come. The human mind is the ultimate battlefield, and the ability to control perception is the ultimate weapon. The scientists of Bletchley Park, who had provided the intelligence, that confirmed Operation Fortitude's success, returned to civilian life, with their extraordinary contributions largely unrecognized. For decades, their role in breaking the Enigma code and intercepting German communications remained classified. Alan Turing and his colleagues had been crucial to Operation Fortitude's success, yet they would never receive public acknowledgement for their work. The intelligence that had validated the deception and confirmed that Hitler still believed the false narrative had come from Bletchley Park. But the codebreakers would remain invisible figures in history, their contributions hidden behind walls of official secrecy. Churchill lived out the remainder of his life, carrying the knowledge of the moral compromises he had made to preserve Operation Fortitude. The Prime Minister had kept the French ignorant of the invasion point. French resistance fighters had died in misguided uprisings. French civilians had suffered in operations planned based on incomplete intelligence. But Churchill believed that the strategic victory justified the moral compromises. The liberation of Paris, the liberation of Europe, the defeat of Nazi Germany, all of this had been accelerated by Operation Fortitude. Churchill reasoned that the lives saved by shortening the war outnumbered the lives lost through the deception. It was a calculation that haunted him until his death, a moral ledger that could never be perfectly balanced. Decades after the war ended, Operation Fortitude remained one of history's most remarkable achievements in human deception. It had demonstrated that wars could be won through psychological manipulation, through the careful construction of alternative realities, through lies so powerful that they reshaped military decisions across an entire nation. Operation Fortitude proved that in warfare, perception is reality. The deception that had been planted in German minds proved more powerful than truth itself. And as the world moved into the modern era, military strategists, intelligence agencies, and political leaders studied Operation Fortitude's methods, understanding that the greatest victories often come not from superior firepower, but from superior understanding of human psychology and the power of carefully constructed deception. The operation that had changed the course of World War II had also changed how humanity understood the nature of truth, power, and the endless human capacity for sophisticated